At 3:47 in the morning on June 20th, 1631, a 19-year-old woman woke to the sound of splintering wood. Her door wasn't locked. There were no locks in her village. Why would there be? Everyone knew everyone. The last crime anyone could remember was a stolen chicken 3 years ago. The men who burst into her room spoke a language that sounded like nothing she'd ever heard. They grabbed her by the hair, dragged her from her bed in her nightclothes. Outside, the entire street was burning. Her neighbours were screaming in the darkness. Children were being pulled from their mothers' arms. Old men who tried to fight back were beaten until they stopped moving. Within an hour, 237 people from her village were chained together in the town square, watching their homes turn to ash. By sunrise, every single one of them was on a ship heading south. She had never seen the ocean before that morning. She'd never been more than 5 miles from the place she was born. 3 weeks later, she was standing naked on a platform in a market 1,200 miles away, while strange men bid on her body like she was livestock. This happened. Not in ancient times, not in some distant barbaric age. This happened while major cultural works were being created across the continent, while new settlements were being established, while renowned artists were painting their masterpieces, and she wasn't alone. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million people from coastal regions were captured and sold as slaves in territories across the sea. 1 million. Men, women, children, fishermen from northern coasts, farmers from southern islands. Entire villages emptied in single nights. Even people from the frozen edge of the known world woke up to find armed raiders breaking down their doors. Think about that for a moment. For 250 years, the sea wasn't a pathway for trade and travel. It was a hunting ground, and coastal populations were the prey. Let me tell you who was hunting them. The raiders weren't random criminals. They were state-sponsored predators operating from fortified ports along the coast. Imperial powers backed them directly. Every slave sold meant tax revenue for distant rulers. Every raid was documented. Every captive was inventoried. This wasn't piracy. It was an industry. Their fleets sometimes numbered 30 ships. They had scouts who studied coastlines, identified weak defences, tracked the movements of fishing vessels. They attacked at dawn or in the dead of night when resistance was impossible. They took everything, gold, silver, grain, but their primary target was always people. Because people could be sold, then sold again, then sold again. You weren't a human being to them. You were inventory, a renewable resource, something to be captured, evaluated, priced, used, and resold until there was nothing left to sell. In one raid, commanders captured 7,000 people in a single summer. 7,000. That's not a raid. That's a harvest. An entire region depopulated in 3 months. In another attack, raiders took 6,000 captives in one night. The entire town. Everyone. The only people left were those too old or too sick to be worth the trouble of chaining. In one documented case, they reached the furthest northern settlements. 400 people captured from an island most didn't even know existed. Imagine being a fisherman in that remote location, waking up to armed men speaking a foreign tongue, men from a continent you couldn't point to on a map. Men who chained you to your neighbours and marched you to ships you'd never seen before. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated military operations with specific targets. Young women and children brought the highest prices. Always. Strong young men were valuable for labour, but women between 15 and 30, they were the most valuable merchandise in the entire system. Now imagine living on the coast during this period. Every night you went to sleep wondering if tonight was the night. If you'd wake to screaming. If by morning you'd be in chains on a ship heading to a world you couldn't imagine. For 250 years, that was reality for millions of people. Entire coastal regions were abandoned. Watchtowers were built every few miles. Warning bells rang through the night. Fishing villages moved inland, away from the sea, away from the wealth that fed them, because staying near the water meant waiting to be taken. But warnings weren't always enough. The raiders adapted. They learned which villages had rebuilt their defences. They bribed local criminals for information about patrol schedules. They waited for storms that forced warning systems to fail. Then they struck. Some from coastal communities actually switched sides and joined them. They knew local languages, geography, and fears. They became guides for the raids, translators during the sails. The most successful switcher became one of the wealthiest operators in the trade. He personally captured thousands of his former countrymen. Money has no loyalty, profit erases identity. Let me tell you about another woman. She was captured at 22 years old while travelling on a merchant ship near a busy trade route. The raiders boarded at dawn. They showed no mercy to men over 40. Useless for heavy labour, useless for sale. Their bodies went overboard while their families watched. The young men were chained, the women were chained. Then the ship turned toward its destination. She spent 17 days in the cargo hold, chained to 40 other women in a space so tight they couldn't lie down. They sat hunched against each other in complete darkness. The smell was unbearable. Vomit, waste, fear itself taking physical form. No light, no fresh air. Just the sound of the ship creaking and women crying in languages she didn't understand. Some women died during the crossing. She heard the splashes. She counted 7. 7 women who would never see land again, never be mourned, never be remembered. One woman chained next to her stopped eating on the 3rd day, stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th day, she was dead. She sat chained to the corpse for hours before the slavers noticed and dragged it away. When they finally reached port, they pulled her up to the deck. She hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 weeks. The light felt like knives in her eyes. The first thing she saw when her vision cleared were the white walls of the city gleaming in the sun. The second thing she saw was the market. The process was brutally efficient. Captives were taken to public baths, washed, their wounds treated just enough so they wouldn't die before the sale. Then they were sorted. Strong young men went to manual labour or the rowing galleys, chained to oars, rowing until their bodies gave out. Most died within 5 years, chained to their benches, unable to move, fed just enough to keep rowing. When they died, they were unchained and thrown overboard, and another slave took their place. Educated men were sold as tutors or accountants, more valuable, better treated, but still property. Children were trained as servants. The youngest ones were converted, raised in a new system, given new names. They grew up never knowing where they came from. Women over 35 went to domestic work, invisible labour in wealthy households, cooking, cleaning, raising other people's children. But young women between 15 and 30, they were the most valuable merchandise in the entire market. They were destined for private quarters in wealthy homes. Before the sale came the inspection. Women were taken to elevated platforms in the centre of the market. Potential buyers walked around them, examining them like livestock. They squeezed their arms to check for muscle, pulled open their mouths to inspect their teeth, examined every inch of skin for disease or defects, and in many markets women were displayed completely, nothing hidden, nothing left to imagination. Buyers ran their hands over bodies that didn't belong to them anymore, touched whatever they wanted, verified the merchandise. A witness who worked ransoming captives documented what he saw in 1634. He wrote that young women were put on full display in public squares, examined like animals being sold at auction. Buyers touched them everywhere to verify health and suitability. The women who resisted were beaten until they learned that resistance was useless. This wasn't hidden. It happened in broad daylight, in public squares, witnessed by thousands, completely legal, completely normal. Now imagine standing on that platform, a young woman from a village where you knew everyone by name, where your biggest worry had been whether the harvest would be good, where you'd never been alone with a man who wasn't family. Now strangers were examining your body, speaking a language that sounded like noise, their hands on your skin, their eyes calculating your worth. You were sold for a price equivalent to 8 farm animals. You had no idea what that meant, no idea that your buyer already owned 7 other slaves, no idea that your life as you knew it was over forever. The journey to the final destination took 6 weeks, kept in the cargo hold with 20 other women, different regions, different languages. None of them could communicate. But fear needs no translation. When they arrived, they were taken directly to the house. Other slaves immediately removed the captives' clothes and burned them. Everything from the old life, gone. They bathed the new arrivals in perfumed water, dressed them in clothing they didn't recognize. You didn't recognize yourself. That night the owner visited. The young woman had never been with a man. In her village, such things happened after marriage, with someone you chose, someone who knew your name and spoke your language. The owner spoke no familiar words. He didn't need to. Years later, one captive managed to send a letter to her family through a ransoming intermediary. One of the only first-hand accounts we have. In it she wrote that she could not describe what she suffered that first night, only that she wished for death 1,000 times. But death did not come, and every night after was the same. That was the reality of captivity, not luxury and exotic romance, not the fantasies artists depicted without ever seeing what they painted, not privileged comfort, captivity, forced submission, survival, and the psychological torture of knowing this was forever. No rescue coming, no army marching to save you, no hope of seeing home again, just endless days turning into endless years. Some women went mad. They screamed at walls, spoke to people who weren't there. The other slaves would restrain them until they exhausted themselves. The ones who couldn't be controlled were sold or simply disappeared. Others found ways to survive inside their own minds. They created small rituals that gave structure to formless days. They remembered songs from home, recipes their mothers made, the sound of rain on roofs they'd never see again. Anything to hold on to who they had been. But most simply went numb. It was easier that way. Daily life depended entirely on who owned you. But patterns were universal. First, constant pressure to convert to the dominant faith. Conversion didn't make you free. You remained property, but it slightly improved your status within the household. Those who resisted were punished. Beatings, food deprivation, isolation in dark rooms for weeks. Second, you were forced to learn the local language. Those who learned quickly received slightly better treatment. Those who couldn't, or wouldn't, were considered rebellious. They were punished more severely until they learned or broke. Third, and this is crucial, no captive had legal rights. None. She could not testify in any proceeding, could not own property, could not refuse the owner anything, could not leave the house without permission. She was, in every legal sense, an object, a thing, property with no more rights than furniture. Most women ended up in one of three situations: brutal domestic work, cleaning, cooking, childcare, 16-hour days with no rest, frequent punishments for minor mistakes. A burned meal could mean a beating. A broken dish could mean no food for days. These women rarely saw the outside world. They aged rapidly. When they could no longer work, they were sold to poorer buyers or abandoned in the streets. Concubinage. If the woman was young and attractive, her owner used her whenever he wanted. In wealthy households, there were multiple concubines competing against each other for favour. If a concubine gave birth to a son, her status improved slightly. She might gain small freedoms, but daughters were worth less. Too many failures to produce sons and she'd be sold or demoted to domestic work. Resale. Many slaves were bought and sold multiple times throughout their lives. Each sale was a new trauma, a new public inspection, a new owner with new demands and new cruelties to learn. Some women were sold 5, 6, even 10 times. Every sale meant starting over, learning new rules, new expectations, new ways to survive another day. But there was one destination feared above all others: the imperial residence in the capital city. The private quarters weren't a single building. They were a massive complex inside the palace. Over 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, kitchens, gardens. At its peak, they held between 500 and 1,000 women simultaneously. A city of women, all of them property. Most weren't from coastal regions. They were from other territories considered the most beautiful by prevailing standards. But captives from ships were present, a rare and valuable minority. To reach these quarters, a slave had to be extraordinarily beautiful, young, usually between 12 and 18, and she had to survive a brutal selection process. Agents roamed slave markets across the empire searching for candidates. They bought the most promising ones and brought them to the palace for evaluation. Physical inspections that made the public markets look gentle. Tests of temperament, learning ability, health, the ability to please. Most were rejected and sold to other buyers. Only a small percentage was accepted. Once inside, training began. It lasted years. New slaves learned the language, proper etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to look at a man, how to look away. The goal was to transform them into refined companions worthy of the ruler. But here's the brutal truth that shatters every fantasy about these quarters. Of the 500 to 1,000 women living there, only a small fraction, maybe 50 or 100, would ever see the ruler in person. And of those, only a handful, maybe 5 to 10 in an entire generation would actually spend the night with him. The rest lived in permanent limbo, not free, but not serving the purpose for which they were captured. They spent years, sometimes decades, waiting for a summons that never came, growing older in gilded rooms, watching their beauty fade, knowing that with each passing year their chances decreased. And when a ruler died, all women who hadn't given birth to his children were transferred to a separate complex where they lived the rest of their lives in even greater isolation. They never left, never married, never had children. They simply existed behind walls until death. Records mention one captive, identified only by a single name. She entered the quarters in 1650 at 15 years old. She died there in 1702 at 67. 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the ruler, not once. Never left the complex. Her only function for 5 decades was serving women of higher rank. When she died, she was buried in a cemetery for palace slaves. No name on the grave, only a number. The administrative records listed her with an identification number. Origin noted. Status, deceased. Cause, advanced age. 52 years reduced to a number and 2 words. That was the reality. Not power and luxury. A gilded prison where thousands of women disappeared without leaving any trace except a number in a ledger. So why did authorities allow this to continue for 250 years? The answer is shameful. Nations were divided and weak. Religious wars consumed every resource. States didn't cooperate to face the threat because they were too busy fighting each other. Some governments had profitable trade agreements with the powers backing the raids. They didn't want to risk those relationships over some captured peasants and fishermen. And some actually profited from the system. Turncoats got rich. Merchants traded goods regardless of where those goods came from. Ransoming captives became its own industry. But the ransom system was slow, bureaucratic, and favoured the wealthy. A rich merchant's daughter might be rescued within a year. A poor fisherman's wife might wait forever. Most waited forever. One woman was among the lucky ones. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they owned to raise the ransom. A fortune for a working-class family. She was freed in 1739 and returned home. But when she arrived, she discovered something devastating. Her fiancé had married another woman. Her mother had died of grief 2 years after her capture. Her father was financially ruined from raising the ransom. And her community rejected her. They saw her as contaminated, dishonoured. No one wanted to marry a woman who had been enslaved. The assumptions about what had happened to her, true or not, marked her forever. She lived the rest of her life alone, working to survive. In her diary, preserved in archives, she wrote that she would have preferred to die in captivity than return to this life. At least there her shame was private. Here it was public and eternal. The situation only changed in the 19th century when one nation began military operations against the raiding bases. They invaded in 1830 and ended the system for good. But by then, over 1 million people had been captured. The vast majority never returned. The young woman from the opening spent years in captivity. When she was finally freed, she tried to return home, but her village was gone, her family, her life, everything she knew, erased. Her name was read during community gatherings for captives. Every week for years. Every week, no answer. Eventually they stopped reading it. She was forgotten. This isn't just the story of a few individuals. It's the story of over 1 million people whose lives were stolen by a system of human trafficking that operated openly for centuries. The coasts still remember. The archives still hold the names, the numbers. And now you remember too.